Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another webinar on EXOS education. I'm Stefan Underwood, Vice President of Staff Development and Methodology. I'm really excited to be talking about one of our frameworks that we use in coaching and how we really view things through the lens of a movement mindset. So I remember being at a conference one time and heard a great debate, and it's the age-old debate in our industry of saying, which exercise is better, right? And we've got, in our industry, we have influence from so many wonderful places. And you're going to see the takeaway here, spoiler alert up front, is that there is value to all of them, and we utilize all of them in our programming. But it was that age-old sort of barbell versus quote-unquote, I think the individuals, what they were referring to as functional exercise, but this idea of which exercise is better, barbell squatting or a Turkish get-up. And it was this really a good, solid debate. And the individual talking about the back squat was saying, look, if you are looking for developing your core, there is no better exercise than back squatting. And of course, had scientific literature to talk about activation of the pillar of the core during a back squat. And I think what it made me realize is just, it's all about context. Yeah, if you're talking about strengthening your core, I tend to agree. Get under a heavy bar instead of that Turkish get up. But I don't program Turkish get ups personally for core strengthening, quote unquote. Right? And so it's this idea of context is what matters. What are you trying to achieve with the exercise you are doing? And is that exercise now the most effective way of doing that? What is the gap that you identify working with an athlete? And what is the best way to plug that gap? So spoiler alert again, the answer is we back squat and we do Turkish get-ups at EXOS. But which exercise is better? You can't answer it because it is context dependent, right? And so really you have to think of this idea of a beach. Look at all of the sand, right? When you look at a beach, the thing that we'd say is no beach is made of a single grain of sand. But what's a beach without sand? Meaning every program has so many different elements. It isn't about just one thing. The program can't just center around Turkish get-ups or back squats. What are we trying to do? And the reality is both of those things have a time and a place, right? We can look at how complex movement is. And I'll never forget when I was coaching NFL Combine prep and I was working with a group of young men preparing for the NFL Combine. And I was fortunate enough to be around one of the most incredible athletes I have been around in my near 20-year career. We're talking just that individual that when he moved, it was flawless. It was beautiful. And he was at record-setting pace for the 5.10.5 in the NFL Combine. His change of direction was spectacular. I have a video that I captured of this individual where his angles into the cut are so incredible, so aggressive, that his inside leg shin almost looks parallel to the ground, right? And everyone else in the group would say, I want to cut like him. And what was the solution they saw? Well, I need to practice cutting more. The way to get better at doing the 5.10.5 is more 5.10.5s. And to an extent, yes, but that's only looking at one grain of sand on that proverbial beach. And that's the key takeaway. Because let me tell you a few other things about this individual. He squatted with great technique 3 times his body weight. He was strong. It takes strength to absorb that kind of force at that kind of speed at those kinds of angles, getting in and out. Now we know better angles in or better angles out are faster times. His mobility, like not only his strength, but his mobility, the dorsiflexion it took in his ankle for him to be able to create those angles was incredible. Right? And I could go on and on and on. And this is where I often, when I'm teaching mentorships for EXOS, I often will, when it comes to teaching change of direction speed, I will talk about how agility and on-field performance is really the culmination of every single biomotor ability that we have. So for people to say, well, I want to cut like him, we've got to figure out what is preventing them from that right now. Are they strong like he is? Are they mobile like he is? Can they make the shapes he makes? Can they move between shapes the way he does? And do they have the strength profile, the force velocity profiling that he does? It isn't simply go practice that more. Understanding movement is complex and multifactorial. When coaching movement, we can't become myopic on just one grain of sand. We've got to view the whole beach. So the learning objectives for this webinar we're going to understand the framework that helps us do that and bring context and ultimately purpose to what we're doing, right? And it is this framework that you may have heard of talking about position, pattern, and power. We're going to break that down in a checklist-like fashion to bring context to what we're talking about. We're going to demonstrate that checklist of requirements within each of those three levels. And then we're going to demonstrate how that context determines where the program should focus across the continuum, which provides us with a fourth P of purpose. So with that, let's dive in. The first thing we need to understand is, what does it take to move well in sports? And I'll tell you, I'm trying to provide here a fairly decent sized list, but this in and of itself is such an incomplete list. And that is the whole point here. We really want to start working your checklists and look at the complexity of movement. But to get started on the 4 Ps, let's talk about what it takes to bring movement to life on the field of play. The first is, you have to be able to create positions. When we say position, we're talking about biomechanical prerequisites. We're talking about your physical ability to make shapes, right? I've had another great conversation with someone where they're saying, what does it take to achieve a great launch angle on a first or a zero step, right, in a 40-yard start for your combine athletes? Well, it takes a lot of things, right? But one of the things we know it takes is certain biomechanical prerequisites. It takes ankle mobility, it takes hip mobility, it takes thoracic spine mobility and control. It takes control of the body, right? And when you look at something not pre-programmed like sprinting, but you look at something field of play, I always think of years ago, Bengals receiver in the NFL coming in for a touchdown. There's one person to beat and simply front flips over the person, right? I really love the sports company Adidas really talks about this idea of creators and creativity. And it's this notion of, the more positions your athletes are capable of making, the more creative they can be within their sport. It gives them a more robust movement signature to pull from. We don't want to tell them how they have to move. We want to give them as many pieces in their, Lego pile as possible for them to build whatever they want to build, for them to create. That's the key, right? I boulder. I enjoy rock climbing. It is literally called solving a problem. You look at a boulder in front of you and you're trying to climb it. You're solving a problem, and you get your body into some strange shapes to solve that puzzle. If I lacked internal rotation in a hip, if I lacked overhead shoulder flexion, if I lacked biomechanical prerequisites, these positions, then I'm going to have decreased performance. So there's no way we can just coach a person into that with verbal cues. We need to make sure that they are biomechanically able to make the shapes we want to see. That's what we're talking about when we say position. But then as we zero more, we can't just look at individual positions, those snapshot moments, that quintessential acceleration picture, that quintessential absolute speed picture, that quintessential arms overhead catching a snatch picture. We've got to look at how they get there. Life isn't still shots. Life is moving from shape to shape. And we want to look at the pattern with which people choose to move. And I will say that your pattern is influenced in a couple different ways. Your pattern is influenced from the top down of a pyramid. And what I mean there is by speed, by strength profile, rate of force development, rate of force absorption. We know that patterns change at higher velocities, right? But for the context, a lot of what we're going to talk about today, we also know from the bottom up and positional capabilities. And this is where you get into what the industry will talk about of quote unquote corrective exercises, or what we will simply call fundamental movement. That also influences position, of teaching people motor control as they work to link segments of their body, what we'll talk about as a kinetic chain, and how we want to have that kinetic linking through the chain to optimally move from position A to position B. But then in the field of play, you've got to do it with some kind of intent, right? In this picture here, we don't want this individual to throw this medicine ball in slow motion. We've got to put some oomph behind it. We need horsepower in the engine. And so I think the thing we're talking about here starts to get to the root of that question of Turkish get up versus barbell squat, right? There is no doubt that a barbell squat is a valuable exercise. I will never argue against that. Right? We know it is, and is one of the most quintessential researched movements we have. But it's a weight room man-made movement. And until I work in college hockey, until they bring a squat rack out to center ice and have a squat competition, like unless I'm working with powerlifters where that is the competition, then that can't be the end game. It can't just be squat more weight, right? But it is one of those grains of sand. And so we need to look at the shapes they can make, how they move between shapes, but then now their force velocity profile as an individual of how they now express those shapes and the rate at which they express them. Those things begin to piece together to give us how we view movement at EXOS and how we can start to gain purpose in our programming as we say, what can we assess is missing? And this is the key, the bottom line up front, and the thing I wish I was told in the early days of my career. You need to identify where a fault, where a dysfunction is taking place within these levels if you want to have a chance of correcting it efficiently. And here's what I mean, right? This is the key takeaway, the one big thing to write down. You can't solve a positional fault with a pattern-based cue. You can't fix a positional fault with a pattern-based cue. You also can't fix a power fault with a pattern-based cue. You need to have a targeted approach, understanding where the fault lies. And here's what I mean. Let's go back to that 0 step on that acceleration moment. Someone's coming out on their first step, and we know we want an angle. We want to see them create this aggressive angle, 37 to 42 degrees, coming out, driving out, propelling out. Well, if they don't have, let's say, dorsiflexion, hip flexion on the front side, internal rotation of that front hip, if they lack it significantly, that's going to affect the angle they create because they're going to put themselves in a place to be successful. And they're going to know that they don't have that range of motion. So they will compensate, likely by coming out at an improper angle or losing posture. Equally so, pattern-wise, they could just not understand the pattern, and we can help drill that pattern into them. They may not understand the mechanics and linking shapes together, but equally so, they may be weak. They might be weak. They might have inappropriate body composition, right? When I was coaching NFL Combine as a movement coach, I thought I had the easiest job. It's the one that has the most guys on you. What are guys 40 times? What do they run? It's the one pressure. You're the phone number that the agents have. You know what makes the difference? Honestly, the strength coach that I'm working with who's got the weight room inside that is changing their force velocity profile and i.e. their strength to weight and power to weight ratios. The dietitian was the best secret weapon that I had, period, in my back pocket to be able to help influence, again, power to weight and strength to weight ratios, right? It isn't just get stronger, more powerful. It can be change body mass, body composition so that they can achieve that angle. And then I had physical therapy and athletic trainers inside doing their thing to improve positional capabilities and pattern-based capabilities. So when it came to being outside, I basically had to help people who were already phenomenal athletes put one foot in front of the other and run fast. Not to downplay what I did, but we've got to understand it was a team approach. And we looked at position, pattern, power, and we came in with targeted answers. Because if a person lacks, let's say, 20 degrees of internal rotation on their hip, they'll have a funky squat pattern. It will show up in how they cut, change direction, and how they move. And there's no pattern-based cue that will magically fix it. But we're an industry of pattern-based cues. I challenge you. Look at your cues right now. Think through the cues you use the most. We're an industry of drive through your whole foot, knees out, chest up. We are an industry of pattern-based cues. RNT-based cues. We're an industry. Put a mini band around their knees to prevent valgus collapse. Look, I'm not saying any of those are a bad cue. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. What I'm saying is recognize how all of those are going to influence the pattern with which a person chooses to execute that movement. And at the end of the day, if they don't physically have the biomechanical prerequisites to make the shapes, or if they are just plain too weak, or they don't have the right force velocity profile, then you can mini band their knees or tell them to drive their knees out and chest up all day long, and you're not going to get anywhere. And it'll be frustrating for you and frustrating for them. So that is the take home of this whole thing. is work to identify whether there is an error at position, whether there's an error at pattern, or whether there is an error at power. Then say, what is the tool that fixes that fills that gap? And so going back to our initial debate around Turkish get-up versus barbell squat, if they have a power default, well, you know what? That squat's probably going to do more for them in their acceleration or in their movement. Getting them stronger is going to do more for them than that Turkish get-up might. But equally so, if they're struggling with some of their pattern or motor control and owning ranges of motion and linking segments together, then that Turkish get-up might have a little more transfer to the field of play and how we move than just this bilateral man-made movement that is absolutely without doubt augmenting the human, right? Is absolutely without doubt changing force velocity profile, but it's not necessarily teaching them to move differently. And I know what I'm saying can be controversial because I know people listening will love the squat. And again, please don't interpret it that we don't squat. But the point is, in some scenarios, to transfer out to that field of play, we believe that the Turkish get-up has its place in teaching that kinetic linking and helping to help that individual with pattern-based faults begin to link segments together. So let's dive deeper into what I'm talking about here and look at a real-world example. So here we go. We've got a rugby player making a phenomenal shape in a game. And as we look at this shape, he is really propelling off of that right leg. His left leg is driving into triple flexion and preparing for the next stride. He is excessively rotating toward that flex side because he's also looking at the individual number 3 coming in to tackle him and getting prepared to deliver what I assume is a stiff arm. But even if he wasn't rotating that far, he would still have rotation toward that side because this is how we move. And this is where I talk about understand your positional requirements to make the shape, understand your pattern requirements to make the shape, and understand your power requirements to make the shape. We're going to stay on this picture here for a while, and we're going to break down each of those levels. So let's start with positional requirements. Again, this is not a complete list, but these are things you've got to be looking at in your athletes. Because if they don't have these biomechanical prerequisites, they are going to likely not make the shapes you want them to make. So the first thing, let's look at that front side ankle. Triple flexion starts down there, open chain dorsiflexion. The individual who lacks dorsiflexion is going to alter how they move. They just got a smaller, less robust movement signature. They have fewer options to be creative on the field of play, right? They're starting to get wedged between a rock and a hard place. Open chain dorsiflexion. Screen your athletes, check it, look for it. We look for around 40 degrees, right? We also need to look at knee flexion and the ability for them to possess relative tibial internal rotation. So as they come into that triple flex position, that knee needs to flex and that tibia needs to rotate, okay? So again, if they're lacking this ability, this is something for you to either target in your pillar prep or movement prep as a coach, or if you have an integrated staff, it is an opportunity for you to collaborate with your physical therapists and your athletic trainers to improve their ability to show these positions. Staying on triple flexion, we know what's next, it's the hip. So in the hip, we've got hip flexion. And what we need to understand is the way that femur articulates on that pelvis, right? The way the femur articulates on that pelvis as this individual is coming into triple flexion leads to relative internal rotation of the femur. We need our athletes to possess internal rotation. We can bucket those 3 things together, saying ankle flexion, knee flexion, tibial internal rotation, and hip flexion, relative internal rotation. They bucket together, and we want our movements to improve those ranges for the athletes we work with to give them more area to create within when they're in the field of play. Let's move up into the backside hip there. So if we're running through and just to call out this backside ankle here, this backside ankle is displaying plantar flexion. This backside knee is expressing extension with relative external rotation. And then let's really focus on this other hip because I want to get in this split pelvis idea. While the front hip here, the left leg was flexed with internal rotation, the backside leg is extended with relative external rotation. And I know I've just said a lot of biomechanical terms. So again, we can slow this down and you've got access to these slides to go through and relate. But this is gait. This is a truth of human movement. The leg that comes into triple flexion, whether in open chain or in closed chain, if you're talking about someone landing from plyos, needs to be able to, at the same time, in a coordinated movement, be able to display control of dorsiflexion of the ankle, knee flexion with tibial internal rotation, and hip flexion with relative internal rotation. Okay. The other side, when we are propelling away from the ground, or that backside leg in the scenarios, we are creating separation and we're creating length, or we're leaping off the ground in a plyo, in a bound, needs to be able to pair together or bucket together ankle plantar flexion, knee extension, and hip extension with external rotation. That's what happens in gait. That's what happens in movement. And I'll tell you right now, if this athlete lacks one of those ranges, he, in this scenario, is going to have fewer options of how to move. He's still going to solve a problem. He's still going to get the job done, but he's probably going to do it by putting undue strain elsewhere in the system. If we move up and we start to really talk about the pillar and how all this plays into the pillar, you can have different legs doing different things because we got two of them, but my torso can only rotate one way at a time, right? So if we start looking at the upper body here, you'll start seeing this idea. In this scenario, he's got thoracic spine extension with rotation left. And this is a key thing to talk about, right? Positionally speaking, this individual is always, even if he isn't turning to stiff arm this individual, if you just have someone sprinting down a track, they are going to show that they are going to have rotation toward the triple flexed side. Their thoracic spine will rotate toward the front side mechanics, toward the, in this scenario, left knee. And it will therefore be going away from the extended leg. Pay attention to everyone moving as they get into cuts, out of cuts. Picture someone shuffling into a lateral cut. They plant their foot, they load. Which way is their torso going to go? Rotating in as they load and coil in, it's going to come toward that flexed side. As they propel away from the ground and they get out of that laterally in an open step, they're going to create separation and they're going to extend and externally rotate that hip while their torso goes away from that hip, right? Sprinting in a straight line, it remains true. Watch people move, but this is how these things bucket together. And if you lack the positional ability, if this individual can't rotate his thoracic spine to the left, he can't get around to not only coil and create torque on the left side of his body to prepare for his next step, he also can't get around to deliver the stiff arm, right? I used to play rugby. That was my sport. What could be lovingly called a big F off, right? If you don't want to say a stiff arm, but he's about to put the palm of his hand right into number three's potentially face and try and create some separation, right? And so he can't do that. He can't create in that way if he can't rotate around that far, right? Or if he does, he needs to do it by now. What would he do if he's trying to stiff arm number three and he can't rotate his T-spine? He would try and overly, right, get back and abduct that shoulder and put a lot of strain at the shoulder and get in a compromised position with the upper extremity to try and compensate with the shoulder because he can't get there with the T-spine. I've had a lot of conversations with our staff, and I know that they get uncomfortable with some of the biomechanical conversations, right? There are people that say, slow down, right? That it is technical language. But here's the thing. We need to know this as a field. We need to be better. We need to understand the world of movement through biomechanical prerequisites, that we have a shared common language with our physical therapists and athletic trainers. And so that we can serve these athletes, we can understand where injury risk lies, but also where we can increase their overall movement signature, give them more room within which they can move and create movement on the field of play. But it isn't just about individual positions. I've been talking already, teasing this idea of how you can bucket things together. In this scenario, we can really talk about two global movement themes, right? Of how we bucket them together, and those become our patterns. So let's talk about patterns. Let's talk about patterns of the front side hip. The front side pattern is what we can call flexion with rotation. It is a flexion rotation pattern. We rotate in life. I love talking about how life is a rotational sport. Sprinting in a straight line is a rotational sport. We can't just classify rotational sports as things where you like really aggressively rotate. Hockey, golf, baseball. Sprinting in a straight line requires a degree of rotation, because if you weren't able to rotate, you wouldn't get your center of mass over your base of support when you're standing on one leg, and you would fall over. Right? It's all about managing your body in space, and we are built to rotate. Our glutes, our hips, what we talk about as an industry as being the powerhouse that we utilize, they are most powerful in the transverse plane. And so when we look at how we create torque, how we move, rotation is a key piece of that. And so this global flexion rotation pattern, it could also be called a coiling archetype. It's how we coil. It's how we absorb force quite often. And it is bucketing together that idea of, in one seamless motion, we're seeing dorsiflexion of the ankle, knee flexion with tibial internal rotation, hip flexion with internal rotation, and the torso rotating toward that side. And then when we think of the musculature to run it, we can really start looking at the role of our oblique slings, our anterior and posterior oblique slings. Think of the line of musculature that connects the shoulder on one side to the hip on the other. Anterior oblique sling going from the front side of one shoulder to the front side of the opposite hip. Posterior oblique sling going from the back side of a shoulder to the back side of the opposite hip. And we name the slings for the shoulder. So in this scenario, the right anterior oblique sling would be the line of musculature coming from the front side of the right shoulder. For this individual, think of that rugby ball, where that ball is placed, and that line of musculature that comes down across deep through obliques to the front side of his left hip. And that, in this picture here, we think of bands on a person, it is concentrically working to rotate. But at the same time as that concentrically works to rotate, let's think about the lengthening on the back side. So going from the back side of his right shoulder to the back side of his left hip, that is circled in yellow there, is getting lengthened out and has to have eccentric control to allow that rotation left. And it is putting stretch on that system so that as soon as that left foot goes in the ground, he can create separation and have his next step and accelerate through to try and score or try. Right? Equally so, you've got the opposite side working. So in this scenario, if we look at his left front side of the shoulder to his front side of the right hip, you can see that that's lengthening out, right? His left anterior oblique sling is on stretch here, is lengthening out, which means the connection between the back side of his left shoulder and his right glute right now is concentrically working. And if you follow those lines, it makes perfect sense, because right now his left hip is loaded on stretch, prepared for the next step. And his right glute right there is doing a heck of a lot of work, but not in isolation, not just as glutes, as part of this whole symphony of a larger global network. So flexion rotation is that front side. Extension rotation is what's happening on the back side, where we see plantar flexion, knee extension, hip extension with external rotation, and rotating away from that side. These are the global patterns we need people to be able to make. So we've outlined, if we pause there for a moment, we've outlined the shapes we need people to be able to make in terms of individual segments or positional capabilities. We've then bucketed or put those together to define the kinetic chain, to say, yeah, these things, it isn't just saying I need ankle mobility, I need knee mobility, I need hip mobility, but it's saying what range paired with what other segments. I need dorsiflexion in conjunction with hip flexion. I need plantar flexion in conjunction with hip extension. I need internal rotation of the hip in conjunction with flexion. I need external rotation of the hip in conjunction with extension. These are the patterns that athletes begin to display. And then as we ask them to do it at varying speeds or with varying loads, we need to consider the power, right? This individual has some decent thighs on him, right? Like there is a degree of maximal strength We know that as we look at force velocity profiling, the upper left corner of that force velocity curve, and his maximal strength, that sort of sets the foundation or the capability of all other types of specialty strength. We need our athletes to be strong. So none of this, when I talk about positions and patterns, is meant to say that we can just do corrective exercise, quote unquote, or functional or fundamental movement to build an appropriate rugby player. We need to put some mass on the individual and have some strength and power and force velocity profiling for what is a violently combatant sport. In addition to maximal strength, though, we need that strength to be able to be displayed within a limited amount of time. So we need to train maximal power and think of his ability to create separation here and propel his body away from these two would-be tacklers, right? It takes a degree of maximal power. And both those things are in relation to him moving himself through space. So body composition has to be considered, right? We have to consider body composition. If this individual is carrying excess body mass, he would not create separation as quickly, and those would-be tacklers would likely become actual tacklers. He fails to make the play. He can't create the way he needs to create in the field of play. And then we can also think of speed characteristics and stretch shortening cycle, right? And we have fast and slow stretch shortening cycle. I know I'm not saying anything new here. We're talking quite literally about all of your force velocity profiling. And what I want to try and show is how all of these things work together to create your checklists. And by the way, I'm not claiming what I've gone through is a complete checklist, but the key is breaking down this one singular static image to be able to say what it took for this individual to do this. We can have biomechanical conversations. We can have muscular activation and sling-based and pattern-based conversations, or we can have glorious strength and conditioning and force velocity profiling conversations. And all are true. Just like the NFL Combine athlete that I was working with, that everyone wanted to cut like him. They also had to therefore move like him, have the mobility that he had, the stability that he had, the control of that through patterns that he had, squat 3 times his body weight, have a 43-inch vertical. They have to put that all together. They can't just go put out cones, practice, and hope to one day cut the way he does because they keep doing that cone drill. Again, movement on the field of play is literally every biomotor ability that we have. So how does this come to life in our potential programs? And that's what we're going to discuss next. For this scenario, we're going to focus on mostly the front side and associated upper quarter spine. So again, I'm looking at the things it can do to help shape that archetype or that shape of coiling. So we're looking at this individual's left leg here. And this is where we really need to talk about the idea of a standard language. Again, I said it earlier. There are some that will say, listen, you're using big words, or you're rattling through biomechanical terms, and we're talking about, relative internal or external rotation, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I say we need to understand that as performance coaches, because there isn't this line that stops. It's not like this is what physical therapists do and this is what performance coaches do. It's really a blend. Right? It's really a blend. And we need to be able to work with our therapy teams. A good performance coach should be able to do 80 or 90% of what that physical therapist does, certainly staying within scope and certainly not going to that 10, 15, 20%, whatever it may be, of manual therapy. A performance coach is not putting hands on someone and mobbing something. But in understanding patterning of movement and being able to recognize errors and dysfunction within movement and seeking to correct that, we should strive to continue to get better. And I know it's what I'm always doing. Most of my conversations around this are with physical therapists to challenge me to get better, right? This is their world and I want to understand it more. Equally so, though, a physical therapist should be able to do 80 or 90% of what a performance coach does. A physical therapist should not just have it start and stop on a table and that's it. Ditch the table, get to movement and start putting some load and mass into things. And yes, maybe a performance coach lives in that higher velocity, higher mass range, unless that therapist has a passion, a hobby, has gotten into Olympic lifting, compete in Olympic lifting, whatever it may be. But speaking in global terms here, yeah, that performance coach has spent their career working on things like Olympic lifting. So there's a time to hand it off. But the key here is we need to have a standard language We need to be able to talk to one another. Physical therapists need to be able to talk about force velocity profiling, and performance coaches need to be able to talk about biomechanical movements. It can't scare them. And therefore, if you're working on integrated staff, it takes a couple things. One is vulnerability, the willingness to say, teach me, I don't know, help me get better, right? But the other thing it takes is people stepping up and educating one another. And so the performance coach taking time to teach force velocity profiling, the physical therapist, and the physical therapist taking time to teach biomechanical prerequisites and movement to the performance coach. Then we're all better. And what we succeed in doing is not just meeting in the middle on pattern of position, pattern, power, but what we're trying to do is taking this overlap in the middle and achieving this, where there's a little bit at each end that we each uniquely own, but we start creating a level playing field where we're all working together for the betterment of the athlete. We understand movement. This is how we view a movement-based system. So let's look at some actual programming. Now look, I've got a lot of words here and exercises, and some of it's shorthand. If they're exercises that you don't know, not a problem. Refer to the webinar description right below, like go down below right now, and look, there are links for all of these exercises. So as you work through this, if you're not sure what a DNS star is, look in the link below. You can click on it, and while I'm talking, you can view it, or you can view it after. You've got a video representation of each of these. But the goal here is to say what positions are required, what patterns are required, and what power is required. And here is a sample idea of how we can target, right, that front side mechanic, that left leg in this scenario for the individual. And we will get a little bit split hip. I have a couple things in there for the right leg as well to get that separation of hip and how we create that separation to have triple extension and triple flexion happening at the same time. But in general, if we look here, start over in the left side with positions. There are things that a strength and conditioning coach could do. And again, this is nowhere near a complete list, but as an example, I could start off some pillar preparation for an athlete, and I could do things like a quadruped adductor stretch with thoracic rotation. So think of a quadruped rock, one leg straight out to the side. You rock back and then you rotate, lace your hand through. And again, there's videos of all these for you to refer to. But as you rotate toward that flexed hip, right? Not the straightened out hip. You're creating thoracic rotation towards a flexed and internally rotated hip. You're quite literally helping them work on mobility in a ground-based supported movement that is making the same shape this individual is trying to make right now as he creates separation to avoid those two tacklers. Another example would be a shin box with rotation. Right? So shin box with rotation, you're sitting in it. Some call the shin box a Z-sit, if you're more familiar with that language. Now we're sitting and we're rotating toward that lead leg. So again, I'm looking at that, making that shape. I'm putting stretch on the posterior cuff of that lead leg. That left leg is flexed, right? And in this scenario, you might be saying, but that lead leg is externally rotated. It is, but as I rotate toward that side, it's going from more externally rotated to less externally rotated. So even if in an instantaneous moment it's externally rotated, what does it take to go from more external rotation to less? It takes internal rotation. So it patterns, or it works on, the position of being able to have thoracic rotation with hip flexion and working into internal rotation. So we can look at movements like that we tend to put in pillar prep at EXOS. If you want to even prepare more before that, in pillar prep, we follow a logic chain of soft tissue, followed by mobility, followed by stability. So you could say, what do we need to do here? What we need to do soft tissue work of the posterior hip, right? What are the things that need to be able to lengthen? To get in that triple flexed position, what do we need to get? We could work on soft tissue of the calf. We could work on soft tissue of the posterior hip. We could work on soft tissue of paraspinals, posterior oblique sling, working through what helps our thoracic spine rotate and extend. If you have a clinician with you, this is where they can get in and get into some work that is outside scope a little bit for strength coaches, right? And that clinician could come in with some ISTM instrument assisted soft tissue mobilization. Think of things like gua sha or rock blades, right? Scraping, if we just say a general term. of the posterior oblique sling, or maybe they get some hands on and do some ART of that left posterior hip or with a belt mob, right? Like trying to work on actually getting in to working on both tissue dynamic or joint dynamics and tissue compliance, right? So the clinician can absolutely help if there is a limitation for the athlete, but that doesn't mean the strength coach then can't also provide input to the system with some soft tissue work where they want, and then go through these kinds of mobility-based exercises like quadruped adductor stretch and a shin box, both with thoracic rotation added. I told you in pillar prep, we then get into stability, and that's where we go with pattern. In that pattern column, we're going to still target that in pillar prep at the beginning of a session to get a person ready to go, locked up, dialed in, ready to be on the field, ready to go create the shapes they want to create. They can fit in your programming and complementary movements. So while you're resting from your big primary and secondary movements, they can fit in on regen days, or like I just said, they can really fit in on pillar prep days. But we're now talking about things like the list in the middle for pattern. I'm going to go through a few of these and try and call out what we're trying to do. We'll start with the DNS star. Again, if you're not familiar with DNS star, again, all of these have videos linked in the description below. That DNS star is loading. Now, it's picture a side bridge, a side plank position, but off of your inside knee. So again, we're ground based. And as you are you then sit back into that hip, that bottom hip. As you do that, you are eccentrically lengthening the posterior hip. You are loading and coiling into that bottom side, absorbing force in that bottom side. You are triple flexed. You will have dorsiflexion, but your knee will be flexed and your hip will flex and your pelvis will internally rotate on that femur, or the femur will be relatively internally rotated on the pelvis as the pelvis moves on the femur. And you will see the torso rotate toward that side. And what I say in pointing that out is if you watch the video, you look at the DNS star, you hit pause right as the model is at the back side. They've sunk into that. They're in the most flexed position they can be in. And then you come back to this and you look at the shape that this New Zealand rugby player is making in this moment. Okay. And it's the same shape. It's quite literally what his left hip is doing right now. Right? What his left hip is doing right now is what the DNS star is working on teaching, that how we sync those things together from a pattern standpoint. Then we come to that half Turkish getup, right? Half Turkish getup. So Turkish getup, but just coming through to the post to high bridge position. Think of what happens as I'm about to raise my hips up into the sky, and I bring my hips up into the sky, toward the sky, I'm extending my hip and relatively externally rotating in that hip, and my torso is rotating away. And again, go to the video below, click on it, watch it, pause it at the moment when the model's hips come to the highest, and then invert that and look at the shape being made by this individual. I said we were working on the left leg. That's what his left leg is literally about to do. As that left foot hits the ground and then produces space and gets away, right, creates separation from the people trying to tackle him, he goes from this flexed position to an extended, externally rotated position. And when his left foot hits the ground and he drives that into the ground, which way is his torso going to go? Back to the right, away from the left leg. So the DNS star, if you look at this position, or if you look at this pattern, in the picture of this individual, the DNS star is quite literally what his left hip is doing right now. And the half Turkish getup is working on quite literally what his left leg is about to do. We can also work on patterns where we either feed the pattern or resist the pattern. So we can talk about a half kneeling stability lift, which will feed into the pattern, right? It's going to help create that reflexive length, and it's going to help reflexively stabilize that hip in that position with rotation. We can also look at stability chops where we're resisting the pattern. So I'm having to fight to hold that flexion pattern because if that band or that bar wins, it pulls me out of it. I externally rotate my femur. I lose my big toe on the ground. I come out. We can then bring people off the ground and we can look at T hip mobility with tubing, for example. Take a look at the video of that one. See how we are articulating the pelvis over the femur being fixed. The goal is to keep the femur as still as possible and teach that pelvis to articulate on the femur. Think of that internal rotation. Think of that power of the glutes, and then think of what you're doing in your programming. Okay. Maybe you're doing this already, maybe you're not. But if you're not, it's a gap that is an opportunity for upgrade. If most of your glute work comes from moving your femur on your pelvis, so I'm talking about things like clamshells. If I'm lying on my side, mini band around my knees, and I'm doing clamshells, my hips are staying still, my femur's moving, right? But then we look at how people move on the field of play and gait, and we understand that the pelvis needs to move on the femur. I need to be able to articulate the pelvis. I ask you, do you have that represented in programming? Hopefully, yes. But if not, look at things like the T-hip mobility with tubing and see how we're teaching that individual the ability to articulate that pelvis on the femur, load into it, and then come out of it. And we look at the posterior cuff of the hip, lengthen under control and eccentrically load, just like what is happening right now in the picture. And then we teach how that torso comes the other way away, and we come back up and we go into external rotation and we have the pelvis go the other way, which is what the left leg is about to do. So again, we're starting to feed these patterns, and we start off so far focusing on one pattern. But as we get down to the bottom here, we start working between patterns. That ability to reflexively start going from flexed to extended, or the flexion rotation pattern to the extension rotation pattern. Reflexively, that's what movement is. So then we can get into medicine ball pass, working from a single leg squat to a single limb stance. We can also start working on things like plyos, or mixing plyos and med balls, like a lateral bound to a perpendicular toss, laterally bounding out to the side, loading. When you laterally land, if I go from my right to my left and I load into my left, I'm going to rotate my torso toward that flex tip. I'm going to absorb, then I'm going to get out of that quickly, propel back toward the wall. My leg's going to then, that left side's going to extend, externally rotate, and that ball is going to go toward the wall, right? So I'm starting to reflexively work on these things of get in, get out, feet out, lengthen, contract, all reflexive in nature. And then you can progress out to your rhythm and coordination drills on the field of play. And these are your technical and pre-programmed drills. These are wall drills. These are marching and skipping and bungee resisted work, right? And then we can worry about power. And now and by the way, strength and conditioning and clinicians both can absolutely go dominate that area. Now we get into power. Because again, if I want to cut like my guy in football, I need to be able to squat triple my body weight before that's going to happen, right? So we can start talking about things that are high force at low velocity, that are total body, worrying about kinetic linking, pillar strength, and transference of force. A barbell back squat is absolutely ideal for that. We can also talk about looking at maximal strength and targeting just the lower extremity and looking at a rear foot elevated split squat. I know a barbell heavy. I know that this is another controversial thing. But in a barbell back squat, what typically fails for a person, it's usually not leg strength, it's usually the pillar. They lose posture. But if I take a 400-pound or 500-pound squatter, I guarantee that they can do more than 50% of their 1RM for bilateral on a unilateral. Because now, let's say I take a 400-pound squatter, and that's a 1RM 400-pound squatter, and I give them 225 on a barbell for rear foot elevated split squat. They, relative for their core, to hold posture, 225 is relatively light to them. They're a 400-pound squatter. But that's heavy as crap for that one leg, that rear foot elevated split squat. So we can really start to target max strength of the lower extremity. We can worry about max power and introduce Olympic lifting to these individuals. We can worry about speed strength and get into things like prowler sprints or resisted sprints on the field of play. We can get into max velocity based things as I'm sliding down the force velocity curve here left to right, and worry about things like plyometrics or applied movement drills. And then all the while we can loop in our registered dietitian and optimize body composition to enhance power to weight and strength to weight ratios. The point is, as we look at programmatic elements, when we say, what does it take to be able to move? It takes a lot of crap. It takes a lot of stuff. And no one of these grains of sand alone is the picture. The answer can't just be, I got to get everybody to squat more weight, bigger, faster, stronger. But I also can't say, I just got to do all these correctives and do a bunch of Turkish get-ups and everyone will run faster. And I also can't just stretch people. None of these grains of sand are incorrect, but none of them stands alone as a beach. And that's how we have to look at movement-based program design. And you can target all of these elements within one session. You have your pillar prep. You have your movement prep. You focus on positions and patterns. You get to your technical and pre-programmed drills outside on the field. Now you start expressing it more, but you're still working on patterns. Then you get to full speed applied movement drills, and you're working on part of their force velocity profile, as well as their ability to apply what you've just opened up for them in that movement signature. Then you take them from the field into the weight room and you work on their force velocity profile and where they need help based on where they are as an individual and in their season or off season. And whether you're looking at generating high force to low velocity, whether you're in a max power phase, whatever you may be. And all the while we are fueling our athletes, working with registered dietitians and seeking to optimize body composition, manage inflammation, help them recover optimally for the next session. Now you have a system that is rooted in movement. I know I've said a lot. Leave this for another day. We didn't even discuss what happens above the shoulders. I fully respect that some of you are sitting here right now saying, well, that's not what happens in the field of play. What about reaction time and viewing stimulus around you and reactive agility versus change of direction speed? And I agree with you. It's time for another, that's a different topic in a different webinar at a different date. But there is everything happening above the shoulders. But hopefully what I have shown as we work through a summary here is that within your program, you want to focus on position, pattern, and power. But when you have an athlete who's struggling and you want to help them with a targeted approach, you have to identify where their primary faults exist. I've worked with athletes who have positional faults. I've also worked with athletes who have pattern faults. And I've also worked with athletes who have power faults. Position faults, that stereotypical, super tight, can't move, does not move well. Doesn't mean they can't be successful as an athlete. By the way, I've worked with an NFL vet that's 10 plus years that did not do well on a functional movement screen and could not move well. But if we're saying we want to lengthen as many careers as possible, and for most people, give them as many options as possible of how they can express movement, give them that toolkit so that they can create, well, you got to identify those with position faults. The pattern-based faults, I'll give you an example. I had an individual who set the world record in the broad jump at the NFL Combine, had all the power you could imagine. Power to weight ratio was explosive as all get out. But initially, his 40 time did not match what it should have been. And it was simple pattern faults. Those are beautiful because they're the easiest to fix. It was teaching a little bit of work as a speed coach and out there working with him on his movements and then seeing that 40 time just fall right into place. And it was a beautiful thing. And in power faults, there are people that come to you underpowered. And the answer for them is a barbell. They need to get stronger. And when you start looking at your program through that, you assess where the fault lies, and then you come with a targeted solution for that fault. You don't ever chase a position fault with a pattern cue or a power fault with a pattern cue. Now the path ahead allows for programming with purpose. And it brings us back to the first question posed. Which is the better exercise? And hopefully if I've done my job here and given a few things to think about, the answer is, it depends. But hopefully through the past hour, I've given a sense of what it depends on and made a big argument for why both of these exercises should be in our programming, but they both serve different purposes within the programming. Thanks so much for joining me for this webinar. It's been a blast. I hope that we see you on future webinars. And that's all that we have for today. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you next time.